The smoke had barely cleared from the shattered decks of Pearl Harbor, but the acrid smell of burning oil and pulverized steel lingered. It was a constant, sickening reminder of December 7, 1941. The U.S. will have Pacific Fleet lay crippled, its battleships rested ignominiously on the harbor floor. America, stunned and enraged, was galvanized. Amidst the despair, a new strategic reality took hold. The Pacific, once a distant theater, was now the crucible. Here, America's skill and valor must stand the acid test alone. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a man of gentle demeanor but exacting standards, arrived in Hawaii. He came to survey the devastation. The task of rebuilding the fleet, almost from scratch, fell to him. He confided to his wife, his voice heavy with the impossible truth. "Darling, the fleet's at the bottom of the sea. Nobody must know that here. But I've got to tell you." President Roosevelt's orders to him had been stark. "Get the hell out to Pearl and stay there till the war is won." Nimitz, though initially plagued by pessimism, confessed, "I will be lucky to last 6 months." Yet he understood the monumental task ahead. The future of naval warfare, he knew, would not be fought by the battleships now entombed in Iron Bottom Sound. It would be fought by the aircraft carriers that had, by sheer chance, been at sea during the attack. The Japanese, however, were not finished. Their audacious expansion southeast from Rabaul threatened vital sea lanes to Australia. A hidden tripwire was struck on July 6, 1942. Martin Clemens, a British agent and coast watcher, transmitted a pivotal radio message. He was operating from a jungle hideaway on Guadalcanal. Living off the land, relying on native sympathies, and reading Shakespeare to settle his mind, Clemens reported the construction of a Japanese airstrip. It was on the island's tropical plain. This dire place, with its narrow beaches, palms, and kunai grass, was well suited for airfields. Clemens' transmission, made under immense pressure and a fear that if I lose control everything will be lost, would bring salvation. It directly triggered the U.S. offensive. But before that, a moment of American audacity had already deeply shaken the Japanese high command. In April 1942, Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led a daring air raid on Tokyo. This psychological blow, while causing limited material damage, profoundly angered Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. A man of strategic foresight, he was provoked into pledging the destruction of the U.S. fleet. This set the stage for Japan's aggressive counter-strategies. He sought a decisive climactic battle that would crush American naval power once and for all. Back in Washington, the strategic direction of the war was a battleground in itself. Officially, the Germany First strategy held sway. It prioritized the European theater, but Admiral Ernest J. King, appointed Chief of Naval Operations in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, was a formidable and unyielding opponent of this doctrine. King was famously described as the antithesis of cooperation. He was a mental bully who shaved with a blowtorch. Even he acknowledged his own abrasive nature with the remark, "When things get tough, they call for the sons of bitches." General Dwight D. Eisenhower, frustrated by King's difficult personality, once quipped, "One thing that might help win this war is to get someone to shoot King." Yet, beneath the prickliness, King possessed a deep understanding of naval power. He held a fierce Pacific First conviction. He viewed Germany First as little more than a political campaign slogan. Nimitz, a courtly man, initially struggled under King's early, often discourteous interference. He endured a period of internal turmoil, but a pivotal confrontation with King ultimately secured him greater operational autonomy. King's basic orders were clear: keep communications with the West Coast open, clear the Hawaii-Samoa area of Japanese presence, then expand toward Australia. He even advised Nimitz and his subordinates to read an article titled, "There is only one mistake: to do nothing." He emphasized the imperative for action. The strategic debates in Washington were tense and complex. President Roosevelt, who initially underestimated the Japanese threat, later prioritized aid to Russia. He declared, "The whole question of whether we win or lose the war depends on the Russians." Prime Minister Winston Churchill, eager for operations in North Africa, known as Operation Torch, reportedly remarked that Americans, unable to have a massacre in France, wanted to sulk and bathe in the Pacific. General George Marshall, the Army's Chief of Staff, worried about not acting decisively. This was a sentiment King dismissed as provincially Eurocentric, fueled by congressional mail and media criticism over perceived inaction, mounted for decisive action against Japan. King, in March 1942, urged FDR to approve a plan for 6 strongpoints in the South Pacific. This was a persistent push for a Pacific offensive. It subtly chipped away at the Germany First dogma. The notion that Germany First was a sole, unwavering directive for all Allied leaders was a myth. King's relentless advocacy would receive vital resources and attention. The US press would receive vital received by Trigigant venue. Navy was also undergoing a fundamental transformation. Limitations imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty had spurred the conversion of battlecruisers. These included the 809-16 and USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. They became aircraft carriers, signaling a departure from traditional battleship supremacy. This shift, however, was not without its internal battles. An ideological war raged within the Navy. It pitted the old guard battleship mentality against flying futurists like Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague. Sprague was nicknamed Ziggy for his kinetic gait. He championed carrier aviation as an idea whose time had come, but the resistance from the battleship-centric establishment was fierce. It challenged the idea that naval aviation was always destined for dominance. Despite the painful lessons of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. carrier fleet began to strike back. The tide started to turn in early May 1942. This was with the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first carrier battle in history. Led by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, this engagement inflicted a significant blow to Japanese expansion. It prevented them from isolating Australia. The decisive turning point arrived in the first week of June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Thanks to crucial intelligence from codebreakers, Fletcher and Admiral Spruance led U.S. carrier task forces in a climactic ambush. This resulted in the loss of 4 frontline Japanese aircraft carriers and 110 experienced pilots. This victory crippled the Japanese carrier fleet. It allowed the U.S. Navy to seize the strategic initiative. With the momentum shifting, King aggressively pressed for an immediate Pacific offensive. He leveraged a victory at Midway to counter Army arguments that the time wasn't ripe. His retort was powerful. "When will the time be ripe, since we have just defeated a major part of the enemy's fleet?" Marshall, recognizing both strategic necessity and the public's demand, eventually agreed. FDR, influenced by this military opportunity and political necessity, supported the Pacific offensive. This signaled a de facto shift in priorities, despite the official Germany First directive. However, inter-service rivalry between the U.S. Army and Navy continued to shape strategic decisions. General Douglas MacArthur's personal and national commitment to return to the Philippines ultimately prevailed. It prioritized the Leyte invasion over Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's preferred Formosa assault. This controversial decision, driven by MacArthur's powerful political influence, placed the U.S. and Code 7th Fleet in a dangerously vulnerable position. The 7th Fleet was often nicknamed MacArthur's Navy. It was designed primarily for amphibious operations. This set the stage for future, desperate engagements. The smoke had barely cleared from Guadalcanal, but the acrid smell of burning oil and pulverized steel lingered in the memory of the U.S. Navy. The island, a crucible of unimaginable savagery, had been more than a battlefield. It was a brutal, unforgiving classroom. There, the very future of naval warfare was being rewritten. The notion that the Guadalcanal campaign was solely an army or marine victory misses the profound bloody education the Navy received. It was here, amidst the suffocating heat, rampant disease, and relentless combat, that naval commanders and their crews understood an undeniable truth. The era of isolated surface engagements was over. Every shell fired, every plane launched, every troop transport protected underscored the vital interdependence of air, land, and sea forces. The old ways were dying in the depths of the Solomon Sea. A new, more dynamic doctrine was rising, forged in fire and loss. From this crucible, a new American fleet began to take shape. Freed from the constricting bonds of pre-war naval treaties, designers unleashed a new breed of warship. This was the Fletcher-class destroyer. These deep-sea thoroughbreds, as they were called, were truly hunting dogs of the fleet. They were built for speed, firepower, and endurance. Their sleek lines and powerful engines reflected a new confidence. Their advanced weapon systems, like sophisticated radar-directed gunnery, were a technological marvel. Yet, technology alone was not enough. It was the human element, the leaders who forged distinct fighting cultures on these ships, that truly made the difference. Commanding officers like Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston instilled an almost familial pride. They fostered an unyielding commitment to go in harm's way. His gun boss, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, famously chose gunnery because he would rather be a hero than a communicator. He pushed his largely inexperienced crews through ruthless drills. He demanded perfection. He turned polywogs into proficient gunners capable of operating complex systems. He prepared them to face any enemy fleet. Complementing these destroyers were the escort carriers, or CVEs. They were the unsung workhorses of the fleet. Often dismissed as mere Kaiser coffins or expendable, these mass-produced vessels were adapted from cargo hulls. They were, in fact, a profound embodiment of American industrial might and ingenuity. They were vulnerable, yes. Their thin skins and basic construction methods made them susceptible to catastrophic damage. This truth was tragically underscored by the inferno that consumed the USS Liscombe Bay. Yet, to call them expendable misses their vital, indispensable role. They projected air power across vast distances. They ferried aircraft. They provided critical air support where larger fleet carriers couldn't be spared. Leaders like Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, a pioneer in naval aviation, understood their value. He fostered morale among his diverse, often greenhorn crews. He walked the decks in his robe and slippers, chatting with the men. He saw the potential in these humble ships and the young men who sailed them. He transformed perceived weaknesses into strengths through ingenuity and leadership. They were not just ships, they were essential, flexible platforms that allowed the US Navy to spread its reach across the boundless Pacific. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy harbored a desperate, last-ditch strategy. This was the Showan Plan. It was born from an overextended war effort. It also stemmed from the crippling losses of aircraft and pilots in the devastating Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That battle had bled Japan's carrier air arm dry. This complex plan was a gamble against overwhelming odds. The myth of Japan still possessing significant carrier-based air power was just that. A myth, while carriers might still exist. They were, as one historian described them, quenched dragons. Their flight decks were largely empty or manned by woefully inexperienced pilots. They were nothing but so many eggs thrown at the stone wall of the indomitable enemy formation. The once proud Japanese carrier fleet, crippled by the loss of its most skilled aviators, was now a hollow shell. It was forced to serve as little more than a decoy. As the ambitious Showan Plan began to unfold, its vulnerabilities were exposed almost immediately. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force, laden with the hopes of a dying empire, set sail. But as his column of heavy cruisers navigated the darkened narrows of the Palawan Passage, they were ambushed. Lurking American submarines struck. In a shattering explosion that filled the night, Kurita's flagship, the Otago, was sunk. The Maya was also lost. The devastating loss forced Kurita to transfer his flag to the colossal Yamato. The surprise attack profoundly disrupted his command structure before the main engagement had even begun. It was an ominous start. It was a grim foreshadowing of the chaos and unforeseen dangers that lay ahead for the desperate Japanese fleet. The liberation of the Philippines, General MacArthur's solemn vow fulfilled, began with his iconic wade ashore on October 20th, 1944. "People of the Philippines, I have returned," he declared. His voice echoed across Leyte Island, but Japan, refusing to concede, unleashed its complex Showan Plan. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet and turn the tide of a war already lost. This was not merely a battle of ships. It was a complex interplay of strategic miscalculations, technological shifts, and the profound human decisions that would chart destinies. As the ambitious plan unfolded, three Japanese forces converged. Each had a perilous mission. To the south, Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force, spearheaded by the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, steamed into the narrow confines of Surigao Strait. There, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commander of the American 7th Fleet Support Group, had laid a meticulous trap. His battle line, comprised of battleships salvaged and repaired from the depths of Pearl Harbor, lay in wait. The engagement that followed was a brutal, one-sided affair. It was a final, thunderous demonstration of traditional naval tactics, including the classic crossing the T. Even as distant radio transmissions brought the raw sounds of that battle into the Combat Information Center of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a profound unease settled over the crew. The sharp crack of great guns and the distant thunderhead of cordite smoke filled the airwaves. One sailor, hearing the play-by-play of destruction, voiced the collective dread. If that's a battle, well, God Almighty, what might we be getting into? The complete annihilation of Nishimura's force marked the final major engagement of battleships in naval history. It was a stark reminder that even in the age of carrier aviation, the old Leviathans could still deliver a decisive blow. Meanwhile, to the north, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force served as a sacrificial decoy. It was a collection of quenched dragons with barely any aircraft. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the powerful U.S. Third Fleet, was famously susceptible to such bait. His obsession with Japanese carriers was a white whale to his Ahab. When his pilots engaged Vice Admiral Taiko Kurita's center force in the Sibian Sea, they sank the superb battleship Musashi. This was after a prolonged aerial assault. The victory only reinforced Halsey's conviction. Believing he had crippled the main threat, he steamed north, drawn by Ozawa's lure. He left the San Bernardino Strait, a vital passage, dangerously unguarded. Kurita's center force, despite its overwhelming might, was already reeling. Ambushed by American submarines in the Palawan Passage, his flagship, the Otago, had been sunk. This forced him to transfer his flag to the colossal Yamato. Then, in the Sibian Sea, his fleet endured relentless air attacks. This culminated in the loss of the Musashi. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 24th, Kurita, lacking air cover, ordered his remaining ships to withdraw westward, but the immense pressure of the Showan Plan compelled him to reverse course. It was reinforced by Supreme Commander Admiral Toyoda's fatalistic order. With confidence in heavenly guidance, the entire force will attack. At 5:14 p.m., he made the fateful decision to resume his eastward advance towards San Bernardino Strait. Under the moonless calm of night, Kurita's column of 23 warships, 10 miles long, successfully transited the strait. It was a silent, ominous advance that went utterly unnoticed by the Americans. Kurita himself, expecting a challenge, was met with astonishment at the silence. Halsey's critical miscalculation had left the 7th Fleet's vulnerable escort carriers exposed. These carriers were designed for amphibious support, believing the greater threat to be Ozawa's decoy, and despite internal doubts from his subordinates, Halsey had ordered his carrier admirals and vice adm. Willis Ching Lee's fast battleships north. The San Bernardino Strait, the very gate through which Kurita now poured, lay open. It was a strategic error that implicitly debunked the myth of Halsey as an infallible bull. It revealed his flawed prioritization. As dawn broke on October 25, 1944, the terrifying reality of this misjudgment became blindingly clear. Ensign Bill Brooks, piloting a TBM Avenger from the USS St. Estate, low on a routine patrol, spotted darkened shapes emerging from the clouds. His urgent report to Rear Admiral Clifton's Ziggy Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, confirmed the impossible. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 to 12 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing in on you at 30 knots. Sprague, initially disbelieving, thought, now there's some screwy young aviator reporting part of our own forces. But the overwhelming evidence forced him to accept the grim truth. It signaled the imminent attack on Taffy 3. Brooks, acutely aware of the overwhelming odds, had a gut feeling that we were never going to see the afternoon. The impossible had dawned. Ensign Brooks' urgent report, initially met with disbelief, had ripped through the morning calm. It revealed a terrifying truth. Admiral Kurita's center force, a leviathan of battleships and cruisers, was bearing down on Taffy 3. The odds were unthinkable. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, commander of the escort carriers, knew his flatops had minutes, not hours. But even in the face of certain annihilation, Sprague's response was immediate and defiant. He ordered his task unit to turn east, directly into the wind. It was a desperate maneuver that would simultaneously allow his vulnerable carriers to launch their aircraft. It would offer a slim chance of evasion. It would head towards the distant open ocean. I thought, we might as well give them all we've got before we go down, Sprague declared. His voice was firm. If we were going to expend ourselves, I wanted to make it count. He then gave the order that would etch the names of his destroyers and destroyer escorts into legend. All small boys go in and launch torpedo attack. It was a death sentence. It was a suicide run against ships that dwarfed them. But it was their only chance. The little ships sprang into action. The USS Johnston, already a smoking wreck after its audacious first charge and torpedo strike on the Camano, was deemed a ruin. Yet Captain Ernest Evans, stripped to the waist and covered in blood, his face grim but resolute, refused to yield. Conning his ship from the damaged fantail, shouting orders through an open scuttle hatch, he waved a final goodbye to the men who passed. He was rejoining the desperate fight. His crew, a hobbled destroyer now, manually cranked the rudder. Their bodies were straining. They knew every minute's delay might count for the carriers they screened. They were pounded by an avalanche of shells. Each impact felt like a freight train's coal box was dropped on top of me. But they held the line. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, a pipsqueak against giants, plunged into the fray. Captain Bob Copeland, peering astern, heard a cheer of "We got her." A column of water and flame rose from a Japanese cruiser, likely the Chokai, struck by one of their torpedoes. His crew, too busy operating and fighting, had no time for fear. Gun 52, under the meticulous Paul Henry Carr, glowed cherry red from continuous firing. Its shells raked the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Then, as a procession of foaming columns walked up from behind, from battleships' shells, Copeland desperately ordered all engines back full. The ship shuddered and shivered and quaked. It pretty nearly backed her stern under water. It felt as though I were a bedsheet on a clothesline being whipped by a strong wind in its desperate attempt to evade. The USS Hole, positioned on Taffy 3's northern edge, was immediately pummeled. A blast spattered its passageways with the remains of breakfast. It released a cloud of vaporized green dye. Amidst cries of "Gas! Gas!" Clarence Hood was thrown from his helm chair. But he regained consciousness to find the wheel unresponsive. The ship, with its rudder locked in a hard turn, fish-tailed and leaned. Captain Kintberger and Lieutenant Coleman orchestrated a desperate, on-the-fly torpedo launch. She suffered catastrophic hits to her pharomes. This created a holocaust of superheated steam. Jim Norris witnessed men screaming. Some were scalded and some of them were on fire. A shell sliced off Gun 54's barrel as cleanly as a giant blowtorch. With her torpedoes spent, the hull steamed in an uncontrollable, sickening circle. It was a helpless target. It was mangled and reformed into a grotesque approximation of a warship, and then it sank. The destroyer USS Heeman, under Captain Amos Hathaway, displayed its own incredible resilience. Skillfully conning his ship through rain squalls, smoke and spray, Hathaway emerged directly into the path of enemy battleships and heavy cruisers. He engaged multiple capital ships, including the battleship Aruna. He fired 7 torpedoes at a heavy cruiser, then 3 more at the battleship line. All the while, the sea around his ship boiled with enemy salvos. Walls of water from the Haruna's guns blotted out the sky. The Heeman nearly collided with the Johnston, and then the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. It was a testament to the chaos and the audacity of Hathaway's maneuvers. Covered in dye from near misses, dyed red from head to foot, Hathaway watched the enemy's salvos landing closer and closer. But his crew, a human machine in Gun 52's handling room, worked flawlessly. They fired some 500 shells in a 20-minute duel with a Tone-class cruiser. They landed 50 hits and started several fires. As the surface engagement raged, Taffy 3's aircraft, described as angry hornets, launched continuous aggressive airstrikes. Despite their limited armament, these planes buzzed the Japanese ships. They created a perceived air threat that contributed significantly to the confusion among Kurita's fleet. The constant harassment, strafing runs, and bombs forced the Japanese to constantly evade. This disrupted their formations. Even if the bluffing attacks lacked decisive ordnance, they were effective. This persistent aerial presence, coupled with the suicidal charges of the destroyers, kept Kurita's fleet off balance. The cost, however, was immense. The USS Gambier Bay, battered relentlessly by overwhelming Japanese cruiser fire, had her steering hydraulics knocked out and steam power quenched. She was abandoned. She ultimately became the only American aircraft carrier in history sunk by enemy naval gunfire. Yet, despite holding an overwhelming advantage, Admiral Kurita's powerful center force faltered. He was plagued by fatigue. He lacked his own air cover. He had suffered cumulative losses from earlier engagements. He also faced the surprisingly resolute resistance from what he perceived as powerful U.S. fleet carriers. Kurita became consumed by internal conflict. His fleet was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. He had already lost several heavy cruisers. His motives remain an endless inscrutability. They were described as having elements of the noble and the pathetic before his collapse into imbecility. At 9:11 a.m., on October 25th, Kurita made an astonishing decision. He would withdraw. He issued the order. Rendezvous, my course north, speed 20. The Japanese ships gradually broke off their pursuit. They turned away from their objective. In a final, desperate taunt, Admiral Kimura's destroyers launched a half-hearted last-gasp torpedo attack, but these long-range torpedoes, fired from a steep angle, had barely enough fuel to reach the carriers. Kurita's withdrawal, influenced by the perceived strength of Taffy 3's resistance and the unexpected effectiveness of their air attacks, saved the American invasion fleet. It was an impossible victory. It was secured not by quantitative superiority. It was secured by the sheer human will, leadership, and morale of sailors and airmen. In Kurita's own misjudgment, they were outfought by pygmies. Yet they made him believe he had conquered giants. The Battle of Samar was a testament to how desperation and strategic missteps can alter outcomes against overwhelming odds. It fundamentally altered the course of the war. The last desperate acts of the Samuel B. Roberts and Johnston were not glorious charges. They were brutal, chaotic deaths. Each ship was a testament to a crew's refusal to yield. On the Sammy B, Captain Copeland, a non-swimmer, began a desolate search. He moved through the heavy stench of steam from the No. 1 fare room. He stepped over a headless body draped over a gun tub. Along with the discovery of a dead radio man made him realize the bottom had dropped out of things. His ship, once a very live thing with its men, was now a battered piece of junk. It was a picture that summed up the whole desolate destruction of a living ship, with living men coming into an emptiness of nothing. In Gun 52, Machinists Mate Chalmer Goheen found most of the crew obliterated. Gunners Mate Paul Henry Carr, mortally wounded, like a 19th-century artilleryman, desperately struggled to load one last shell into the wrecked breech. Chief Machinist's Mate Charles Smith lay alive, but riddled with 2,000 shrapnel holes. From these, blood would ooze out like water from a sponge. As water lapped over the port side, Copeland, despairing, learned from First Lieutenant Lloyd Gurnett how to abandon ship. Roll over on your back and swim. Stevenson prayed for the Roberts to sink quickly, if only to deprive the Japanese of the pleasure and the practice. She went down by the stern, head high in the air for a moment, standing like an oblique headstone. It was a moment of profound sadness for Gurnett, who openly sobbed, for Harrington, who solemnly declared, "Boys, take off your hats. There goes a good ship," for the Johnston, having fired all its torpedoes in a 2.5-hour sprint through hell. The end came. It was with a critical hit to the engine room and No. 1 boiler room. This cut steam and stopped the starboard screw. All power and maneuverability vanished. This left her a sitting duck. Electricians Mate Alan Johnson and motor machinists Mate Roger Goujon desperately worked to keep the emergency generator running. They did this by scooping oil into a broken lubrication pipe. Tragically, Goujon died, trapped by the diesel engine. Johnson, covered in his own blood and that of dead shipmates, realized his friend was gone. It was time to get the hell off his dying ship. The Johnston was then engulfed in an avalanche of shells. Each impact felt like a freight train's coal box was dropped on top of me, amidst the whistling rush of wind and explosions. Small, sparking electrical fires cast flickering shadows in the compartments. Captain Evans gave the abandoned ship order. This turned the vessel into a vehicle now suitable only for the dead. On deck, a horrific pile of people bodies half alive, half dead, described as human cordwood, bore testament to the carnage. Sailor Robert Billy, unable to speak or move, was propelled overboard by a shell impact. Officer Ellsworth Welch helped sailors into life jackets and the water. He neatly set his shoes together before diving. Dr. Torfor. Robert Brown refused Captain Evans' pleas to abandon ship. He was dedicated to tending to the wounded. It was a commitment Bob Hagen witnessed before Brown's death. Hagen himself from the director mount had questioned, "What the hell are we doing here? Let's abandon ship." Mercer recalled Marquardt combing his hair and throwing the comb away, saying, "I don't guess I'll ever need that again." Ogorek cheerfully reported to Hagen, "Mr. Hagen, we got off all 10 of them torpedoes, and they ran hot, straight, and normal." Captain Evans and Sartor passed each other, staring blankly at one another. The depth charge racks submerged. The water reached waist high on deck. The water, once a refuge, transformed into a terrifying, predatory environment. The initial chaos of men scrambling over one another, frantic to escape the ship, swallowing seawater, gagging, and lunging with death-grip strength, soon gave way to the horror of the ocean's inhabitants. Sharks, some 10 to 12 feet long, accompanied by hundreds of smaller fish, arrived. Ellsworth Welch, reflecting on the horror, noted, "My contract with the Navy was to fight the enemy, not sharks." Despite initial panic, a grim acceptance settled over men like George Bray and Chalmer Goheen, who tried to quell the fear. Robert Billy, wounded on the Johnston, recalled a shipmate who helped him but was then taken by a shark. As the night wore on, men tried to sing familiar songs like "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," but the effort died out, unable to overcome the overwhelming despair. Jack Moore and Dick Rhodey described the glacial passage of time. The nighttime sky betrayed no sign of its passage. It felt like an entire week of darkness. The group, once noisy, became as silent as a graveyard. The men became half-wasted Taffy, 3 survivors. Their bodies were failing. Their minds were slipping into dalliances with madness. For 2 days they had nothing to drink but brackish water. The tropical waters, while warm, deceptively sapped their heat. Copeland himself, worn down by combat, injury, and the deaths of his crew, began to lose his edge. His thoughts became vague and befuddled. His hands and head lost physical control. Executive Officer Bob Roberts physically supported him and restrained delirious men. Delirium, a poison that had a phantasmagoric effect, led men to envision siren songs of fresh water, hot coffee, and feasts. Tom Stevenson imagined swimming into a Japanese-held harbor. Dick Rhodey looked for lemonade. Frank Cantrell saw a big white cottage on the beach with green shutters. Eugene Wagner, ranting, called Copeland no good. He was physically subdued before disappearing from the raft entirely by morning. Luther Libby, suffering mightily from ingesting seawater, repeatedly tried to find a drink. He promised a shipmate a beer before he too disappeared late, on the second night. The Kapokli fests, good only for about 20 hours, became waterlogged. They lost buoyancy. The weariest and weakest resigned themselves to death. Others lived rich fantasies in their final hours. Rescue was agonizingly slow and fragmented. Admiral Stump had informed the 7th Fleet commander of survivors at 12:30 p.m. on October 25th, but a serious rescue attempt wasn't made until 3:30 p.m. that day. Ships arriving at the specified coordinates at 11:30 p.m. found nothing. The mission, unassisted by planes, had a slim margin for error. As the afternoon wore on, submerged doubts began to surface, along with the first sharks. Up to 50 shark fins were observed near Copeland's raft. Desperate flares red, white, and green asked skyward from a very pistol. But with no response, men feared alerting Japanese ships. The night brought brutal attacks. Clint Carter was bumped heavily in the back. A shark tore away a chunk of his capot and side. Harry Henson was bitten hard enough to crush bone in his thigh. James Cooper and Jack Walker, badly burned, passed away. Their life jackets and dog tags were collected before their bodies were released into the sea. It wasn't until late on October 27th, 2 days after the battle, that a 7-ship task group finally departed San Pedro Bay. It was organized by Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbie and led by the patrol craft PC-623. At 10:29 p.m., Lieutenant Allison M. Levy, officer of the deck on PC-623, spotted very flares. Despite his skipper, Lieutenant Commander James A. Baxter, initially denying his request to investigate, Levy's insubordinate initiative led the ship towards the distress signals. He insisted he would not be relieved until Baxter's eyes adjusted to the darkness. From midnight to 3:35 a.m., 7 rescue ships began retrieving survivors. As LCIs pulled alongside rafts, crew members used the World Series question to identify the oil-felled, nearly naked sailors. Mel Dent's fervent declaration of St. Louis, "God damn it," brought a surge of relief. The decks of PC-623 became a brown-black ooze of blood and fuel oil. It was so crowded with nearly 200 survivors that 5,000 gallons of fuel had to be pumped overboard to prevent foundering. Despite the ongoing threat of Japanese Zero fighter planes, strafing the rescue ships, forcing George Bray from his bunk and Bob Copeland to cower the crews diligently cared for the half-wasted Taffy 3 survivors. They offered clean clothes and baths. By 10:19 a.m., on October 27th, Baxter's group had saved about 1,150 survivors. It was a solemn, unfanfared conclusion to their immediate ordeal. As the smoke cleared from Samar, a grim new chapter in naval warfare began. Shortly before 11 a.m., on October 25th, Taffy 3 came under wholesale kamikaze attack. 5 Japanese aircraft, each carrying a bomb under each wing, plunged into the fleet. One kamikaze, initially seeming to cause minimal damage, struck the USS St. Lo. However, a series of 8 devastating explosions followed over a short half-hour. The ship's immense ordnance, 8 torpedoes, 6 depth charges, 15 500-pound bombs, 40 100-pounders, and 1,400 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition detonated. Burning aviation fuel flowed across the hangar deck. A ball of fire smashed down through the flight deck, mowing down a firefighting team. Radio technician Holly Crawforth and ordnanceman John Gatters witnessed the catastrophic chain reactions. These included a muffled thump that created a pressure wave. Captain Francis J. McKenna oversaw the ship's abandonment as critical systems failed. These failures included a severed left rudder cable. An elevator cable had only 3 of 16 strands intact. A landing hook was shot off. The impossible horror of the war's first kamikaze sinking heightened awareness of other threats for Taffy 3's remaining ships. It signaled the increasingly desperate nature of the Japanese offensive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, despite the dire peril and heavy losses suffered by Taffy 3, secured the Leyte invasion. It was a critical step in liberating the Philippines and severing Japanese supply lines. The Japanese Navy, effectively crippled, was no longer a significant threat in the Pacific. This marked the final major engagement of large Japanese surface fleets. The Japanese Navy minister's somber statement underscored the battle's strategic finality. Our defeat at Leyte was tantamount to the loss of the Philippines. When you took the Philippines, that was the end of our resources. Yet initial press reports, such as the Associated Press's tiny U.S. carrier force routes Jap squadron, presented a simplified victory narrative. It masked the dire peril and heavy losses Taffy 3 endured. The reality was a desperate defense, not a rout, against an enemy that should have annihilated them. In the immediate aftermath, Admiral Halsey prematurely announced victory. In his autobiography, he questioned how Admiral Kinkaid had allowed Ziggy Sprague to be caught. Admiral Nimitz, however, suppressed criticism against Halsey to protect his reputation. He ordered rewrites of official reports with a scrawled, "Tone this down." This was to avoid a Sampson-Schley controversy. This institutional amnesia or ennui initially left many Taffy 3 survivors seething in quiet rage. Looking as if he had come straight from a street fight after the battle, retired in 1951. He never flew again. He rarely spoke of his experiences. Though he predicted history would eventually accord the battle its proper place a half a century or more after I have passed on. Sprague died in 1955. It wasn't until the 1970s that survivors' reunions began. They were driven by a collective need to preserve their history. They wanted to remember their fallen and celebrate their victory. The bonds forged among these men in their late teenage years and early 20s during their traumatic experiences hardened like epoxy. They often suppressed painful memories for decades. A pivotal turning point came with the commissioning of namesake warships in the 1980s. The USS Clifton Sprigg, FFG-16, was commissioned in 1981, though it was attended only by Sprague's family. More significantly, the 1982 commissioning of the USS Copeland, FFG-25, served as a powerful catalyst. It honored Tacoma attorney and Naval Reserve Rear Admiral Bob Copeland. It galvanized the scattered Samuel B. Roberts survivors. This led to their first formal reunion. Jack Hewson, son of a Roberts survivor, initiated the search for shipmates after seeing the USS Copeland announcement. This mirrored similar efforts by other Taffy 3 ship groups. In 1985, the USS Carr, FFG-52, was commissioned. It honored a Roberts' gunner's mate. These events became focal points for remembrance and connection. They demonstrated that a lot of history ain't set down yet. They highlighted the crucial role of personal initiatives in shaping historical narratives. In 2001, a joint reunion of the Samuel B. Roberts, Johnston and Hole associations in Albuquerque offered a powerful moment of generational connection. Captain Paul X. Rinn, skipper of the second USS Samuel B. Roberts, FFG-58, addressed the veterans. He recounted his ship's near sinking on April 14, 1988. This was after striking an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf. Rinn described the monstrous blast that caused the 4,000-ton ship to quickly become a 6,000-ton ship due to flooding. Flames rose 150 feet. In this crisis, Jim Tilley, a fireman, single-handedly performed a suicide start. This was a complex emergency technique, usually requiring 3 people. He brought the auxiliary diesel generator online, restoring critical power. Rinn observed crew members passing the plaque of the old DE-413 and touching it. He felt a chill as he witnessed them bonding with the heroism of the past. He recognized this as the living tradition, inspiring his crew. At these reunions, despite the aging of the veterans, they saw each other as kids, frozen in time, in living color. Bud Comet articulated a lifelong quest to honor his deceased father. He stated, "I'm still trying to impress my dad. I hope, if you've been watching over me all these years, that you're pleased with the way I've conducted myself." The Battle off Samar, a legendary tale of courage and ingenuity, truly embodies the American way of fighting when they don't have superiority. It leaves an enduring legacy that inspires future generations to perform at a level above anything they ever dreamed they could do.